The road was losing its argument with the rain. Marin Colville watched it through the carriage window, the narrow lane dissolving into something that was no longer road and not yet river, the ditches overflowing, the hedgerows bent and dripping, and the whole gray countryside surrendering under a sky that had been threatening since mid-morning and was now following through with absolute conviction. She had mentioned this to Lord Aldrich Vane approximately 2 hours ago. He had not responded. He had turned a page of his correspondence and continued his long-standing practice of pretending she was not there. She was, by now, perfectly accustomed to this. 5 years of being Dorian Colville's younger sister had given her a thorough education in what it meant to be peripheral to Aldrich Vane. He was Dorian's closest friend, his companion since university, the man who made whatever room he entered quietly rearrange itself around him without his ever needing to ask. He was heir to the Duchy of West Hallow, possessor of a fortune discussed at dinner parties, with reverence usually reserved for matters of faith, and owner of a face that caused women in drawing rooms to say things to each other in undertones that Marin found entirely too relatable for her own peace of mind. He was also, without question, the most maddening person she had ever been confined with. And she had once been confined in a carriage with her cousin Bertram, who collected beetles and considered a captive audience an invitation. "The coachman is slowing," she said. "I see that." He turned a page. "The road ahead looks completely washed out. I am assessing." "You are reading correspondence?" He looked up. His eyes were the precise gray of flint, pale and unyielding, with a darker edge at the outer rim that she had spent an unreasonable number of hours cataloging, in winter, light and candlelight, and once in the particular copper glow of a September evening at Dorian's country house, when she had looked up from a book and found him watching her from across the room with an expression she had never been able to name, and had filed carefully under things she was not going to think about. She was not going to think about his eyes. "Miss Colville," he said, with the patience of a man who has decided to be patient and is discovering it costs more than anticipated. "I am managing the situation." "The situation appears to be managing you." Something tightened in his jaw. She watched it with the detached appreciation of a person who has learned to extract enjoyment from limited sources. Then the carriage lurched violently, not a slow list, but a sudden drop to the left that threw her entirely off her seat. She had half a second of cold freefall before something caught her. Both of his hands, large and certain, gripping her shoulders and pulling her back before she could meet the carriage door with her face. They were very close. She could see the faint scar along his left jaw that Dorian had once told her came from a fall from a horse when Aldrich was 14, a detail Aldrich had never once volunteered himself. She could see that his face had changed, the papers forgotten, something sharp and briefly unguarded, crossing his face for exactly 3 seconds before the composure rebuilt itself from the inside out. "Are you hurt?" His voice was different, quieter. "No, thank you." She pulled back. He released her immediately, as though the contact had been a purely mechanical intervention with no other dimension to it whatsoever, and retrieved his papers from the floor. Outside, the coachman and the footman were in urgent conference above the drumming rain. Aldrich set down his correspondence, opened the door, without ceremony, and exchanged several brief words with the coachman. He climbed back in with water darkening his coat at the shoulders, and his expression entirely settled, as though a flooded road were simply one more item on a list he had already anticipated. "The lane floods in sustained rain. There is an inn 1 mile south, the Silver Heart. We will stop for the night." "1 night," Marin said at once. He regarded her with the expression she had long since categorized as his particular variety of managed tolerance. "Yes, 1 night." She looked out at the failing light. Behind them, through the gray, lay Marchfield House and the party they had left that morning, Ahead lay Colville Park and her mother, and the pleasant, ordinary life she had been attempting to return to. She thought of Dorian, who was supposed to have been the one escorting her home, and had sent a note at the last conceivable moment, explaining that matters in the city required him immediately, asking Aldrich, who was passing that way in any case, to see her safely to Colville Park. She was going to say several things to Dorian, at significant length. "Fine," she said. "One night." The Silver Hart sat at the crossing of two country lanes, low and stone-built, with lantern light pressing warm and gold against the dark. The common room was packed past its reasonable capacity, every bench taken, every hook crowded with wet coats, the air dense with wood smoke and damp wool, and a stew that was doing its determined best. A fire burned at the far end, entirely invisible behind the people attempting to share it. Near the stairs, someone was playing a fiddle with impressive commitment and variable success. The innkeeper said it before they had fully crossed the threshold. "One room." "Two," said Aldrich. "One." The innkeeper's hands settled flat on the counter with the weary finality of a man who has said the same word enough times today that he no longer bothers softening it. Storms cleared the London road. Everyone's here. One room, one bed, and best I've got. 9 shillings for the night, supper and breakfast included. He assessed them both in the brief, efficient way of a man who reads strangers for his livelihood. Man and wife? The question landed in the silence between them. "No," Marin said. "Yes," Aldrich said. She turned to look at him. He held her gaze for precisely 2 seconds, long enough to communicate that he had made a decision, and she was going to need to trust it. And then he was already producing coins and setting them on the counter with the quiet finality of a man who has never in his life been refused anything he decided he wanted. "We'll take the room," he told the innkeeper. The key slid across the counter. The innkeeper turned immediately to his next problem. Aldrich placed his hand at the small of her back. Light pressure, barely anything, but it steered her toward the stairs with a certainty that she found equal parts infuriating, and, in ways she absolutely would not examine. Something else. On the landing she stopped. Man and wife. It is the most straightforward explanation. The alternative is explaining why Lord Aldrich Vane, future Duke of West Hollow, is traveling unchaperoned with an unmarried woman of good family. He was already producing the key. "I have given the innkeeper a false name. Aldrich Weston. Merchant. Timber from the Baltic. You are Marin Weston. We are traveling north to visit your family. I am a terrible liar. You are precise and self-contained and perfectly capable of saying very little when circumstances require." He pushed the door open. "Say very little." The room was not large. The bed dominated the space, solid oak with a white coverlet that looked aggressively respectable under the circumstances. A writing desk, a washstand, a fireplace with a good stack of wood, and a window against which the rain pressed without cease. Marin stood in the center of the room and precisely did not look at the bed. "You will sleep in the chair," she said. "No." "On the floor." Also no. He was already crouching at the fireplace, coaxing a fire from the cold grate, with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. She watched the set of his shoulders in the growing light, and thought, not for the first time, that the most genuinely maddening thing about Aldrich Vane was not his coldness. It was the absolute certainty he carried, the deep untroubled conviction that the world had been arranged before his arrival and merely needed his confirmation. 3 years ago, at Dorian's townhouse, she had been in the hallway before supper. Dorian had said, with the easy affection he always used about family, "Fair warning, Marin will be joining us tonight. She will make everything considerably louder than you prefer." and Aldrich, in the dry and unhurried voice she knew to its smallest gradation, had said, "She is not quite what one would order for a quiet evening, is she?" She had stood in that hallway for 10 full seconds, long enough for the sentence to settle into the specific place inside her, where the things she refused to say about herself lived quietly and without invitation. Then she had walked in and smiled at both of them, and been, if anything, more animated than usual, because she was Marin Colville, and she did not show people where they had landed. She had kept those words in a precise location in her mind for 3 years. They were useful. They were a corrective against foolishness. Against, for instance, the particular foolishness of caring what Aldrich Vane thought of her in any dimension beyond the professional courtesy owed to her brother's friend. She had never told Dorian. She would not have been able to explain why it mattered, and she had no intention of trying. Dorian would have laughed, or worse, spoken to Aldrich about it, and she would have had to live out the rest of her days in a state of mortification she was not prepared to sustain. She would not think about them now. A wife, she said, would wear a ring. The silence that followed had a different quality from the ones before it. Brief, considered. The silence of a man who has already thought of something and is deciding whether to produce it. Aldrich straightened from the fireplace. His hand moved to the inner pocket of his coat, with a motion so controlled it barely registered as movement at all, and then he crossed the room and held something toward her. A ring. Gold. Plain, worn smooth at the shank from what must have been years of constant handling. Old and modest, and possessed of the quiet weight of an object, kept close against a person's skin for a very long time. She did not take it. "Whose is this?" she said. A pause. The precise length of a pause that confirms the answer carries weight. "My mother's. She left it to me when she died. I carry it." A shorter pause, clipped. "It is not significant." Marin looked at the ring. She looked at him. His expression was arranged with its usual precision, offering exactly what he chose to offer, and not one word more. She held out her hand. He placed the ring on her finger. 4 seconds of contact, completely impersonal, and she felt it from her hand to her shoulder, and was genuinely furious at herself for it. The ring fit. She looked at it sitting on her hand, with the ease of something that had always been there. A dead woman's ring in a stranger's room, while the rain drove against the glass, and the fire grew behind them, and the fiddle played something mournful downstairs. "One night," she said. "One night," he agreed, and turned back to his writing desk. Marin sat on the edge of the bed, and breathed carefully, and said none of the things she was thinking. She was Marin Colville. She was self-possessed. She was not going to let any of this matter in the slightest. She looked at the chair, where he would presumably attempt to sleep, in a room that had gone cold enough that her breath was just visible. She thought about saying something about it. She decided against it. The ring sat warm on her finger. She did not, she told herself, think about that at all. The storm had not read the innkeeper's estimate, and appeared to have its own timeline in mind. Marin woke to a sky the color of old pewter and rain that had settled into the sort of long, steady, purposeful fall that suggests not weather, but verdict. She lay still for a moment, oriented herself, and became aware of 3 things in sequence. The bed was warm, she was alone in it, and Aldrich was already standing at the window. He was in his shirt sleeves, his coat was over the back of the chair, his correspondence was in his hands, which meant that wherever he had slept, it had not been long enough to prevent him from locating his papers before she woke, and that the situation had not made him any less himself. She found this both irritating, and, in a way, she filed quickly away, quietly reassuring. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was rough with sleep. "All night." He did not turn. I spoke with the coachman at first light. The lane north is flooded over the axle height. The road south has a section entirely gone. He paused. We are not leaving today. Marin looked at the ceiling. How long does the innkeeper estimate? 2 days, possibly 3. She looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at the ceiling again. Dorian, she said, is going to be absolutely impossible about this. I have already written to him, and to my own household. I told them the storm delayed us. I did not include the details. He turned at last, and she was struck, as she consistently was when his full attention arrived without warning, by the precise quality of it. Like standing in a sudden patch of direct sun. We will manage this. 2 days at a coaching inn is uncomfortable, but not ruinous, provided we are sensible. Sensible? She sat up and reached for her boots. Her trunk was still in the carriage, which meant 2 days in yesterday's traveling clothes, which was an entirely appropriate coda to how this journey had been proceeding. Yes, sensible. I am going downstairs for tea and something to eat, and the company of people who do not make me feel like a scheduling inconvenience. I have not said anything this morning that could reasonably be construed as unfair. You project it, my lord, silently, comprehensively, and from across a room. She smoothed her skirts with more force than was strictly necessary. It is a considerable talent. He was quiet. Then, carefully, in a tone she had not heard from him before, something slightly stripped of its usual precision. I am not displeased with you. She paused with her hand on the doorframe. She did not turn around. No, I know. You are displeased with the situation. I understand the distinction. She left before the conversation could become anything other than what it was. The common room was brighter in the morning, and considerably less crowded. Some travelers had departed at first light, regardless of the weather, driven by obligations that outweighed discomfort. Marin found a seat near the fire, accepted tea and porridge from the serving girl with genuine relief, and gave herself precisely 3 minutes of simply existing without being in a carriage or a small room with Aldrich Vane. She was halfway through her second cup of tea when someone said her name. Marin Colville. She looked up. Prentice Hale stood before her, golden-haired and broad-shouldered, dressed in traveling clothes, with the easy confidence of a man who considers his own appearance a settled matter. He was smiling, a wide and open smile that he aimed at her like a lamp deliberately turned in her direction. She had known Prentice Hale for 4 years. They had danced at the Hargrove Assembly and talked about poetry at Lady Fenwick's picnic, and corresponded briefly the previous spring, before she had concluded, quietly and without drama, that his interest in her had a slightly transactional quality she was not inclined to encourage. She had not thought about him in months. She thought about him now, with a feeling she did not have the time to properly examine. Mr. Hale, she said. What a surprise. Entirely mutual. He pulled out the chair across from her without being invited, with the easy familiarity of a man who has never been discouraged from doing anything he wanted, and therefore no longer anticipates the possibility. The storm caught me yesterday evening. I am in no better position than yourself, it appears. His gaze moved over her with a warmth that she found simultaneously flattering and slightly too assessing for comfort. You look remarkably well, considering. I manage. You always have. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. Are you traveling alone? She opened her mouth, and then she felt it behind her, the particular shift in air pressure that she had now, over the course of approximately 16 hours, begun to recognize as specifically his. A change in the quality of the space that meant Aldrich had arrived and had taken note of everything before anyone had turned around. His hand came to rest on the back of her chair, not touching her. Simply there, steady and entirely unambiguous. She is not, he said pleasantly. Good morning. Prentice looked up at him with the unhurried appraisal of a man who assesses things automatically. "I do not believe we have met. Aldrich Weston." He extended his hand, and Prentice shook it, and there was a brief moment in which two very different kinds of composure regarded each other across a handshake. "Merchant. Miss Colville's intended. We are traveling together." "Intended?" Prentice's eyebrows performed a small, precise rise. "I was not aware Marin was engaged. The announcement has not yet been formally made." Aldrich's hand moved from the chair to her shoulder, resting there with a warmth and deliberateness that was entirely, completely convincing. "We are on our way to her family to share the news." Prentice looked at Marin. She returned his gaze with what she hoped conveyed serene contentment. It may have conveyed something closer to a person concentrating very hard on not looking alarmed. "How wonderful," Prentice said. The word was perfectly warm and absolutely hollow. "You must allow me to buy you both breakfast. We are all stranded together. We may as well be agreeable about it." He smiled at her again, and this time, underneath the warmth, she caught something else, something still and watchful, something that had seen a hand placed on a shoulder and filed the way it landed, something that wasn't done looking yet. "Of course," Aldrich said. He drew out the chair beside her and sat, and his shoulder was close to hers, and his hand was on the table between them with the quality of stillness that she was learning to understand. The stillness of a man who has made an exact calculation and is waiting, with complete patience, to see what the board does next. Marin looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at Prentice Hale, who was watching her with that open, pleasant expression that no longer read to her as entirely simple. She looked at Aldrich, who was not looking at her at all. She thought, whatever this is, it is considerably more than one night. Supper at the Silver Heart was served at 8 at the long communal table. The stranded travelers arranged along it without ceremony. Marin sat to Aldrich's left. A wool merchant from the north sat to her right. Prentice sat 3 chairs down, positioned with a clear and unobstructed view of them both. Aldrich played his part without visible effort. That was the thing she had not anticipated. Not the broad performance of it, but the particulars. The way he filled her wine before she had to reach for it. The way he tilted his head when she spoke, as though what she said was worth hearing. She knew it was performance. She was nearly certain it was performance. The wool merchant addressed her cheerfully. "How long have you and your husband been acquainted, Mrs. Weston?" "Long enough," Marin said. "We met through her brother," Aldrich added. "A connection of some years. It took us rather longer than it should have to arrive at the obvious conclusion." He glanced at her as he said it, and for one unguarded moment, it looked precisely like the kind of look a man gives a woman when he has finally stopped pretending. She reached for her wine. Prentice was watching. She felt it without looking. Then the door at the far end opened. A latecomer entered, a man of middle age and considerable weight, dressed in expensive wool that announced itself quietly. He surveyed the room with the satisfaction of someone who expects to be recognized. Aldrich's hand, resting beside hers on the table, went very slightly still. She did not look at him. She looked at the man. She looked at the ring. The newcomer settled into the remaining chair, accepted a bowl of stew, and began a slow survey of the table. His gaze moved from face to face with unhurried authority. When it reached Aldrich, it stopped. He frowned. The frown of a man who is certain he recognizes something, but cannot quite align it with the frame he expected. Then he could. "Vane," he said, with the effortless carrying power of a man who has never found reason to lower his voice. "Lord Aldrich Vane. What on earth are you doing stranded at a country inn?" Every conversation at the table paused. Aldrich did not move. Marin counted 1 full second of stillness, the kind of stillness that precedes something. Then, with perfect ease, I think you have mistaken me for someone else, sir. My name is Weston. Aldrich Weston. The man squinted. You look remarkably like someone else entirely. I'm told so frequently, Aldrich said, and returned to his supper. Conversation resumed around them, but at the far end of the table, the man in the expensive coat had not entirely looked away. And 3 seats down, Prentice Hale had not looked away at all. Marin sat with the ring warm on her finger and understood, with a cold and settling clarity, that the fiction they were maintaining had just become considerably more fragile than a storm. After supper, the common room dispersed itself slowly, travelers moving toward the fire or the stairs or the bar with the unhurried resignation of people who have stopped fighting their circumstances. Marin moved toward the narrow corridor at the back of the inn, where the noise of the room became a murmur, and the air was cooler, and she could, for 3 minutes at least, simply exist without performing anything at all. She had approximately 1 minute. Mrs. Weston, Prentice materialized from the direction of the stairs, with the ease of a man who has always been very good at appearing precisely where someone was hoping not to find him. He was smiling. He was always smiling. She had been studying the smile since breakfast and was beginning to understand it as a specific instrument, one that required looking at very carefully before you understood what it was actually for. Mr. Hale, she said, forgive the intrusion. He did not appear to require forgiveness. I wanted a moment without Mr. Weston present. My intended, she said, and I would rather not discuss this here. Marin. His voice shifted, the performance of warmth softening into something quieter and more direct. We have known each other for 4 years. I think we can afford honesty. She looked at him steadily. Then be honest. Something is wrong here. He said it simply, without decoration. I do not know exactly what. But I know that man is not a merchant from the Baltic coast, and I know you were not engaged 3 weeks ago, and I know that the ring on your finger does not sit the way a ring sits on a woman who chose it. He waited a beat. I am not saying this to threaten you. I am saying it because I am concerned about you. The ring felt very precise and very deliberate on her hand. Your concern is noted, she said carefully. And unnecessary. Are being extremely careful, Prentice said. Far too careful for 2 people in love. Love is careless. Love forgets to be careful. He looked at her with an expression she might have believed completely if she had met him yesterday. Here is what I am genuinely offering. If you are in any kind of difficulty, if this situation has been arranged rather than chosen, I can help you. I have a carriage. I have a coachman who would say exactly what I told him to say. One conversation with the innkeeper, and you could be somewhere entirely different by morning. He paused. All I need is the truth. She understood him now with complete clarity. He was not threatening to expose her. He was threatening to rescue her, which was considerably more complicated, because it arrived wrapped in apparent sincerity and came with something real to offer, and she had nothing obvious to counter it with. I am not in difficulty, she said. You are stranded in a country inn with a man the entire supper table nearly identified as the future Duke of West Hollow. He said it evenly, and the words settled in the corridor, the way stones settle into water. Whatever you are calling this, Marin, it is precarious. He went back toward the common room unhurriedly, leaving her standing in the corridor with the clear impression of a man who has planted something and is content to give it time. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then she went upstairs. Aldrich was at the writing desk, a candle lit against the early dark of the storm. He looked up when she entered, and the small adjustment in his expression told her he had been listening for her step on the stair. She told him everything. What Prentice had said, what Prentice had offered. All of it, including the part where Prentice had looked at the ring with the patient recognition of a man confirming what he already knew. Aldrich was silent for a moment. Then he rose and went to the fireplace and stood with one hand on the mantel and his back to her, in the posture of a man who is maintaining his composure by sustained effort. "He knows who I am," he said. "He suspects. Strongly. Worse." He turned. His expression was controlled, but underneath the control something was moving. A man who knows acts. A man who suspects waits and lets the suspicion accumulate interest. He said the offer was genuine. His offer is a transaction. He wants you to owe him something, to be the man who saved you. His voice was level, the words precise, but she was beginning to hear the thing underneath them. Gratitude from a woman is a far more durable claim than anything he would gain from exposing us. That is an extremely cynical interpretation. It is an accurate one. She looked at him. You seem very certain of what he wants. I have known men like Prentice Hale my entire life. They are charming and perceptive, and they choose their moments precisely. The hand on the mantel pressed a fraction harder. He did not speak to you during supper. He waited until you were alone, and I was not there. I'm entirely capable of managing a conversation without supervision. I know that. And then, with the careful quality of something he was choosing whether to say, "That is not what concerns me." She studied him. She had been studying him for 5 years, and learning very little, and in the past 48 hours, she had learned more than she was entirely comfortable with. "Then what does concern you, my lord?" He said nothing. "Because I notice," she said slowly, "that you are considerably more exercised about Prentice Hale approaching me privately than you are about the fact that he may be about to expose us entirely, which suggests that your concern is not primarily about our situation. Marin, are you jealous?" The word landed cleanly between them. He went very still. She had come to know this stillness, the particular quality of it. The held breath before a concession that costs him something he did not plan to give. "No," he said. Measured. Correct. Completely unconvincing. "I see," she said. "I am concerned about your safety and the integrity of our arrangement." "Yes." "Naturally." She kept her voice even. "And it has nothing whatsoever to do with the way he looked at me at supper." A long silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain pressed on with its patient, steady insistence. Then, very quietly, with the quality of something that escaped rather than was released, "He looked at you as though he were assessing what you were worth." She felt the breath leave her completely. "Aldrich," she said, "go to sleep." He turned back to the writing desk with deliberate finality. "I will take the chair. Lock the door. The chair will be freezing. I will manage. You said that last night." She stopped. He looked at her over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable in a way she was now certain was not natural to him, but was instead the result of careful, sustained work. "Lock the door, Marin," he said quietly. She locked the door. She lay down. She stared at the ceiling in the firelight and listened to him settle into the chair with a long, controlled exhale. From across the room, after a silence long enough that she had almost believed he was asleep, "Do not accept anything from Hale. Not tomorrow. Not an offer, not a favor, not a conversation without me present." "That is not what a jealous man would say," she said to the ceiling. The silence that followed lasted a long time. "No," he said at last. "It is not." Neither of them said anything after that. She woke to warmth. Not the thin warmth of the dying fire. She could feel the chill at the edges of the room where that had failed. But actual warmth. The specific and unmistakable warmth of another person. An arm around her waist. Breathe against the back of her neck. the solid presence of a body pressed to hers, with a care that was, even in sleep, deliberate. She lay completely still, and did not breathe for 3 full seconds. Aldrich. She was still dressed. She was almost certain he was too. But at some point in the deep of the night, the chair had failed him, or he had failed the chair, and he was now lying in the bed behind her, with his arm across her waist, and his breathing slow and deep in the way of someone who has, for the first time in some hours, genuinely relaxed. She should move. She should wake him. She should say, clearly and calmly, that this was not the arrangement. She looked at his arm. She felt his breathing, steady and unhurried, completely different from his waking breath, which was always controlled and careful. She had never heard him breathe like this before. She had never been close enough. She did not move. The fire was entirely out. The room was cold at the walls and warm in the middle. Through the window, a grayish light was beginning to press against the dark. It was not yet dawn, but it was genuinely trying to be. She lay in the trying to be dawn and felt his heartbeat against her back, and held herself very still, and thought about a number of things she had no business thinking, including the way he had said, "Please do not ask me anything right now," and the ring on her finger that fit as though it had been made for her hand specifically, and the fact that a man who carries his dead mother's ring in his inside pocket, against his chest, for years, is not the kind of man who does anything carelessly. She thought, with total honesty, and absolutely no intention of acting on it, that she had never in her life felt as safe as she did in this particular moment, in this particular small room, in a country inn, in the middle of a storm, with this particular impossible man's arm around her waist. She was going to give herself no more time with that thought whatsoever. He woke. She felt the shift in his breathing first, the slight increase in the rise and fall of his chest, then the fractional tightening of his arm, then the held pause of a man whose consciousness has returned and is taking stock before he commits to the full weight of it. Then he went very still. "Miss Colville," he said. His voice was rough in a way she had never heard from him, sleep-blurred, stripped of its usual precision. "Yes." "We are." He stopped. "Yes," she said. Neither of them moved. His hand was flat across her waist, warm through the fabric of her dress. She could feel his heartbeat against her back. It was faster than it should have been for a man who had just woken in a perfectly ordinary fashion. "The chair," he said at last, "was freezing. Yes, I know. I did not intend this. I know." A long silence, during which neither of them moved. "I should," he started. "Yes," she agreed. He did not. She became aware, in the suspended particular quality of the moment, of the ring on her finger, pressing warm between her palm and the coverlet. His mother's ring, the thing he had carried for years against his chest. "Aldrich," she said softly. "Please." His voice was very quiet. "Please do not ask me anything right now that requires an honest answer." She said nothing, which was, she recognized, itself a kind of answer. He moved, slowly and carefully, as though extracting himself from something he was not certain he wanted to leave. The warmth was gone immediately in the way warmth always goes, decisively and all at once, and she sat up and focused with complete concentration on the problem of her thoroughly wrinkled dress. "That did not happen," he said behind her. "Agreed. We both slept. Separately. And woke separately," she said. A knock at the door. Marin went still. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Weston." The serving girl's voice, cheerful and unhurried, from the corridor. "Hot water for washing. And cook thought you might want breakfast in the room this morning, being newlyweds, and wanting your privacy and all." Marin looked at the wall. Aldrich was silent for a moment. "That is very kind," he said. in a voice that sounded almost completely normal. "Thank you." The tray arrived. The girl departed with the brisk tact of someone who had seen several things and decided to have seen none of them. They ate in silence, bread and cheese and strong tea, across the small table, with the focused attention of two people who have silently agreed that breakfast deserves their complete concentration. "The innkeeper says the road may be passable by tomorrow," he said. "One more day." "One more day," he agreed. She looked at the ring. She thought of Dorian, who had said once, very casually, the way Dorian said everything that Aldrich was expected to call formally on Lady Sylvain Drury that spring, that the Drury family had considerable holdings in the north, and that the match made sense on every dimension one cared to measure. She had not thought about Lady Sylvain Drury in 2 days. She thought about her now with the sudden clarity of someone who has remembered a fact they had been deliberately not remembering. "Will someone be expecting you?" she asked. "In particular." He looked at her. He understood the question. She could see him understand exactly the question she was actually asking. "No one who cannot wait," he said carefully. It was not an answer, but it was the most she was going to get, and some part of her, the part she was keeping very firmly at arm's length, thought that it was more than nothing. She found a quiet corner in the common room that afternoon, near the fire, with a book the innkeeper had lent her that she was not reading. She held it at the correct angle and turned pages at intervals that bore no relationship to her actual progress through the text, and she watched the room with the attentiveness of someone who has learned, over the course of 2.5 days, that this particular room contains at least one person worth watching carefully. Prentice found her within the hour. He sat without being invited, which she had come to understand was simply how he moved through the world, and he set his coffee on the table between them and looked at her with an expression she had spent the morning trying to categorize and still could not fully place. It was not entirely calculation. There was something genuinely warm in it. She found that more difficult to manage than calculation would have been. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it as I mean it, not as you are currently expecting it." "That is an ambitious beginning," she said. "I know about West Hollow." She turned a page. Her hand was completely steady. She was quite proud of this. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." He said it without pressure, almost gently. "I recognized him last night. Not from the supper table. That man was merely guessing. From a reception in London last spring, where I was introduced to Lord Aldrich Vane, heir to the Duchy of West Hollow, who shook my hand and looked through me with those gray eyes of his, as though I were something he had already catalogued and found unremarkable." A small pause. "He has not recognized me. I was considerably less memorable to him than he was to me, which is, I have come to understand, rather typical of the man." Marin set the book down slowly and looked at him. "What do you want, Mr. Hale?" she said. "Nothing you will not give willingly." He leaned forward slightly, and she had the impression again of something genuine underneath the strategy, the two things coexisting in him with an ease that was itself a kind of talent. "Here is the truth of it, Marin, and I mean it as honestly as I know how. A man like Vane does not bring a woman he has no formal obligation to into an arrangement like this one without calculating what it costs him against what it buys him. His world is built on those calculations. His father built it that way, and Vane has spent his entire life either perfecting the architecture or pretending to resist it." He waited a moment to let that settle. "You are not the kind of woman who should be someone's calculation," he said. "You are the kind of woman who should be someone's first thought." She looked at him. She thought, "This is the most dangerous thing he has said, not because it is false, but because part of her, the part she has been keeping at arm's length for 2 days, is afraid that he is right about the architecture, if not about anything else." "Thank you for your concern," she said. "Marin, please." "I said thank you." She picked up the book. "I think that is everything, Mr. Hale." He went back across the room, and she sat with the closed book in her lap and looked at the fire and put herself back together, piece by careful piece, with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this for a long time and has gotten quite good at it. Then she went upstairs. Aldrich was by the window. He turned when she entered, and she saw, in the single unguarded second before he composed himself, that he had been standing there for some time. She told him what Prentice had said. This time she was more precise. This time she included the exact words. He was quiet for a long time. "He is not entirely wrong," Aldrich said at last, and she felt the air go out of the room. "I see," she said. "That is not what I mean." He moved away from the window. "Then say what you mean." "I cannot." "You mean you will not." "I mean I cannot." He stopped in the center of the room, and she had the sudden sharp impression of a man who has been running very hard for a very long time and has come to the end of somewhere to run. "The things I could say right now are not things I have any right to say. Not here. Not like this. Not to you." She looked at him. "Try anyway." A very long silence. "I'm terrified," he said. The word fell into the room with the weight of something that has been held for a long time. "Of what?" she said quietly. He looked at her, and for one moment his expression was entirely unguarded, raw in a way she had never seen from him, and suspected almost no one had. "Of what I would have to become. Of what I would have to ask of you. Of how badly I am capable of failing at both." He turned away, shoulders taut. "The storm breaks tomorrow. We leave. And whatever this has been, it is not something I have the right to pursue." She stood very still. He moved to the writing desk. He sat. He opened his correspondence. The subject was evidently closed. Marin looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at his back, rigid and deliberate, the posture of a man who has just said the most honest thing he has said in years, and is now attempting to unsay it through sheer force of routine. She thought, tomorrow. She thought, we will see about tomorrow. She thought also about the word terrified, which he had said as though it had escaped rather than been chosen, as though it were the first honest word he had managed in a very long time, and he was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that he had said it. She had heard people say they were afraid before. She had never heard someone say they were terrified in a voice that sounded like relief. She did not say any of this. She picked up her book, and she sat by the fire, and she read not one word of it. Across the room, Aldrich worked through his correspondence with perfect concentration, turning pages at precise intervals, and she watched him from the corner of her eye, and thought that a man who describes himself as terrified and then opens his correspondence is either the most self-controlled person she has ever met or the most frightened. And she was no longer entirely certain those were different things. The fire burned low. The rain pressed on. One more day, she thought. One more night. And then they would leave and go back to being who they were supposed to be, and this suspended world inside the inn would be filed under things that did not bear examination. She almost believed it. The fire died some time after midnight. Marin lay in the dark and listened to it go. The last small cracklings, the slow settling of the grate, the silence that replaced everything. The room grew cold at the edges first, then gradually everywhere, the kind of cold that does not announce itself, but simply accumulates until it is a fact one cannot continue to ignore. She could hear the rain still, softer now than it had been, patient in a way that suggested it had nowhere else to be. She could hear Aldrich breathing from the chair, slow and measured and deliberate. He was not asleep. He was performing rest, which for Aldrich Vane had always been the same as performing anything else, applied to the task, yielding nothing. "The fire has gone out," she said to the dark. A pause. "I know. You must be very cold. I am managing." She looked at the ceiling. The ring was warm on her finger, as it had been for 3 days. She thought about the word terrified, said in a voice that sounded like something surfacing after a very long time underwater. "Aldrich," she said. "Marin," his voice was careful. "Do not." "I was not going to say anything you are not ready to hear," she said quietly. "I was only going to say that there is a side of the bed that is considerably warmer than that chair, and that the floor between here and it will hold your weight without difficulty." A long silence, the kind that has texture. "That is a very precise offer," he said at last. "I am a precise person." Another silence, then the sound of him rising from the chair, unhurried, quiet. She did not turn around. She felt the mattress shift, and then, very carefully, his presence behind her. He did not touch her. He was simply there, in the way that a fire is simply there, not asking anything, only being warm. "I cannot promise anything beyond this room," he said, very low into the dark above her shoulder. "I know," she said. "This does not change what waits for us outside it. I know that too." A pause in which she could feel him working through something, reaching the edge of something he had been standing at for 3 days with considerable stubbornness. Then his hand found hers in the dark, warm and deliberate, and for a long moment the room held its breath. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. Some silences are the most honest thing two people can offer each other. This one settled around them the way the cold had settled into the room, quietly and completely, filling every space that words had failed to reach and several that words had never been intended for. The ring was warm on her finger. Outside, the rain pressed on without urgency, patient and entirely unchanged, indifferent to the particular weight of what was happening in a small, cold room at a country inn in the middle of a storm. She lay very still and listened to it and thought, whatever the morning does with this, right now, in this room, between these two people who have been running from each other for 3 years, it is real. Outside, the rain fell on without conclusion. She did not sleep for a long time. She woke to gray light and an empty side of the bed that was already cold. Marin lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling and took full account of where she was and what had happened and what the cold, empty side of the bed was telling her. Which was that it had been cold long enough to mean that he had risen well before dawn and dressed and arranged himself back into Lord Aldrich Vane with considerable thoroughness before she had opened her eyes. He was standing by the window, fully dressed, coat and all, his correspondence in his hands, reading with the focused attention of a man who has identified the most important task available to him and committed to it absolutely. She sat up. "Good morning." "Good morning." He turned, and his face was composed and careful, the look of a man who has thought very hard about what his face should be doing and arrived at a precise answer. "The road is clear. The innkeeper confirmed it at first light. We can leave within the hour if you are ready." "I can be ready," she said. "Good." He turned back to the window. "I will have the carriage brought round. I will wait for you downstairs." He left. The door closed with a soft and final click, and she sat in the empty room and looked at the cold side of the bed and the dead fire and the gray light at the window, and she breathed in and breathed out and told herself with precision that she had known this was coming and had chosen to walk into it anyway, and that the knowing made it no worse than it was. She dressed carefully. She stood at the washstand and looked at herself in the glass with the dispassionate attention of a person who is deciding what to present to the day. She pinned her hair with entirely steady hands. The ring caught the gray morning light from the window, and she looked at it for a long moment. This plain gold thing she had worn for 3 days, this particular weight she was already accustomed to. She picked up her gloves. She went downstairs. The common room had the particular energy of a place that has been holding people against their will and is now releasing them. Travelers were collecting their things and their composure. The innkeeper was behind the counter, in full command of the controlled chaos. Outside the windows, Maren could see the lane, no longer a river, simply a lane again, muddy and cold and perfectly passable. Aldrich was at the counter settling accounts. His back was to the room. Prentice was at a table near the door, dressed for travel, a cup of coffee before him, watching the room with that patient quality of his that she had spent 3 days learning to read. He saw her come down the stairs, and he rose, which she had come to understand as simply what he did, a reflexive courtesy that had probably been trained into him so young it no longer felt like a decision. "Miss Colville," he said, "you look well. Considering." "Thank you," she said. "I hope the storm treated you kindly." She looked at him. He was not going to pretend he did not know. That was, she supposed, something. "Adequately," she said. Aldrich appeared at her shoulder, as he always appeared, without announcement, already present. "Hail," he said. Controlled. Pleasant. The voice he used when he wanted something to sound like one thing and be another entirely. "Vane," Prentice said, and did not correct himself, and the words sat in the air between them with considerable weight. From the direction of the stairs, the heavy tread of the man who had made identification his personal project at supper 2 nights ago. He descended into the common room, looked around with the satisfied air of a man who expects his mornings to go well, and located Aldrich with the precision of someone who has been thinking about this since he woke up. "I have written," he announced, pleasantly, to no one in particular. "To Lord Vane's household. Simply a note asking them to confirm a detail. I expect a reply within the week." The room had not been paying attention, but it was paying attention now. Aldrich said with perfect calm, "I hope you receive a satisfactory answer." "I am certain I will." The man looked at Maren with the polite curiosity of someone examining something he cannot quite categorize. "Your wife, is she, Mr. Weston?" "My intended," Aldrich said. "Ah." The man nodded, satisfied by this, and turned toward the bar. And Prentice, who had been watching all of this with the quiet attentiveness of someone who already knows how it ends, said, to the room and to no one, "Though I confess I am curious. An intended and a 2-day inn, no announcement, no chaperone. The Vane family will find this interesting reading." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Aldrich turned to look at Prentice with an expression that was precise and controlled, and underneath it she could see something that was not controlled at all. "That is not your concern," he said. "Perhaps not," Prentice agreed. "But it will be someone's. And when it becomes someone's concern, the question everyone will ask is whether she is what Lord Vane intended." He looked at Maren then, and his expression was genuinely sorry, which she found she almost could not bear. "I simply wondered if you had considered that." The room was listening. The innkeeper had stopped writing. 2 women near the fire had stopped talking. The man with the letter had turned back around. And Aldrich stood in the middle of all of it, with the specific look of a man calculating rapidly against a deadline, with insufficient information and too much at stake. And he said, in a voice that was meant to close the matter, to make it manageable, to contain the damage, "She was not what I had in mind for this arrangement." No. He meant it one way. It arrived as something entirely different. Maren heard the room. She heard the words. She heard, underneath them, the hallway 3 years ago. She is not quite what one would order for a quiet evening, is she? She heard 5 years of being peripheral, of being the inconvenience, of being the furniture that was endured when Dorian had gone elsewhere, and it was only the two of them, and Aldrich had to work very hard not to look at her too long. She heard all of it. She looked at Aldrich. He had already seen it. She could see in his face the exact second he heard himself from the outside, the exact second he understood what it had cost her, and the exact weight of what it had cost. She reached for his hand. She took the ring from her finger. She placed it in his palm with the deliberate care of someone completing an action precisely. Not angry, not theatrical, simply clear and final and completely calm. She folded his fingers over it. She held his eyes for 2 full seconds. Then she turned and walked out of the Silver Heart into the cold, clear morning without looking at anyone, past the coachman, down the lane toward the bare winter hedges, because she needed the cold air, and she needed 30 seconds, and she was absolutely not going to let that room see her face. He was behind her before she had gone 20 paces. Marin. All the management was gone from his voice, all of it. She had never heard him like this, scraped down to something beneath the architecture of him. "Do not," she said. She kept walking. "What I said wasn't what I meant. You know what I meant." "I know what you meant." She stopped. She turned to face him. The lane was empty. The cold was clean and sharp between them, and there was no one to arrange their faces for, and she was very aware of this, and so was he. "I know what you meant, Aldrich. I also know that you said it in front of a room full of people who will remember it, and I know that it sounded exactly like something you said 3 years ago in Dorian's hallway, when you did not know I was there." She looked at him steadily. She is not quite what one would order for a quiet evening. His face did something she had never seen it do. "You heard that," he said. "I have heard most things," she said. "I have simply been very careful about which ones I allowed to matter." She went back to the carriage. She climbed in. She looked out her window. He stood in the lane for a long moment. Then he came and sat across from her and looked at the ring in his hand, and then out his window. And the carriage moved, and the Silver Heart receded behind them, and the silence between them was the loudest and most populated thing she had ever sat inside. He made 2 attempts to speak in the first hour. The first was about the road conditions. The second was about the weather. She answered both in 3 words or fewer, and she could hear, even in the brevity of her own answers, the shape of what she was doing, which was protecting herself in the only way left to her, which was to offer him as little surface as possible. He understood. He always understood the things she wanted him not to. He stopped trying and returned to looking out his window with the expression of a man engaged in a calculation he has been doing for a long time and is no closer to resolving. They traveled in silence for the remaining 2 hours, each looking at their own window, the winter fields unreeling between them, and when Colville Park appeared through the bare trees in the late gray afternoon, she looked at it with the exhausted relief of someone arriving at the place they have been trying to get to for longer than they can reasonably account for. The end was only the beginning of the next thing. She knew that. She looked out at the familiar lane leading to the house and thought about everything that had happened in the space of what should have been an ordinary journey home. 3 days, 1 room, a ring that fit, a man who had carried his mother's ring in his inside pocket for years and produced it without hesitation in the one moment she needed it to be real. She did not know what to do with all of that. She did not know how to put it somewhere useful. She supposed she would figure that out tomorrow. He helped her down from the carriage. His hand was steady and impersonal, as it had been the very first time, outside the Silver Heart 3 days ago, when she had not yet known what his hand felt like, when it was not impersonal. She did not look back when she walked up the steps. Dorian was on the front steps before the carriage had fully stopped. He came down them quickly, with the focused energy of a man who has been waiting for several hours and has used every one of them constructing a version of calm that he was now working very hard to maintain. He reached Maren first. He pulled her into the kind of hug that is really a thorough assessment, conducted through contact, arms tightening, as though to confirm she was structurally intact. "You are all right," he said into her hair. "Completely," she said, with most of the conviction. He held her at arm's length and looked at her face with the dark, direct gaze that had been hers too once, their father's eyes, and he was not fully satisfied with what he found, but he was sensible enough to recognize this was not the moment for it. He looked at Aldrich. "Vain," he said. "Careful, and even in the way he was never careful, and even about anything." "Colville," Aldrich said. He had the look of a man who had been rehearsing and had not arrived at a version he was happy with. "Come inside," Dorian said. Her mother was waiting in the entrance hall, and immediately began the gentle and systematic process of steering Maren toward warmth and tea, and a thorough accounting of her physical condition, presented as concern and functioning as a full inventory. Maren allowed herself to be steered. She could hear, below and behind her, the low register of male voices from Dorian's study. Steady, measured, the controlled sound of two men who care about the same person discussing what that means and costs. She sat in the window seat of her room and drank tea and answered her mother's questions, which were practical and focused and carefully skirted around the questions her mother was actually asking. Her trunk had been brought up, her own things, her own room, the ordinary geography of a life she had been away from for 3 days, which felt, somehow, considerably longer. She looked at her hand. The ring's absence was specific, a particular small weight that was no longer there. She had known it would not be there. She had placed it in his hand herself, deliberately, with full understanding of what she was doing. But knowing something in advance does not always make the knowing sufficient. She did not hear him leave. She learned of it from Dorian an hour later, in the library. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands behind his back, which was how Dorian stood when he was uncertain what to do with his hands, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has received a great deal of information and is not sure how much of it he is entitled to share. He said he would call formally once the roads permitted, Dorian said, and that he was sorry for the circumstances. He paused. That was all he said. She nodded. "Maren." He sat across from her. "What actually happened? The storm. The inn. One room. You know the rest." "I know the version Aldrich gave me, which was thorough and precise, and told me almost nothing of any use." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I know you. I know what your face looks like when something has happened that you are deciding not to tell me. Nothing happened that concerns you. You are my sister. That is the definition." "Dorian." She said his name the way she had said it since they were children, when she wanted him to understand that she was serious and had reached a limit. He understood. He sat back. He ended his understanding with Lady Sylvain Drury, he said, and watched her face. She went very still. "When?" she said. "The day before you left Marchfield. He went to them in person. Told Sylvain's father that he could not in conscience continue a formal courtship when his situation had become, in his words, unclear." Dorian held her gaze carefully. Before the storm, before any of it. She absorbed this. She sat with it the way one sits with something fragile, holding it level, not yet sure if it will hold. "That does not change what he said at the inn," she said carefully. "No," Dorian agreed, "but it changes when he said it." She looked at her empty hand. 4 days passed. She moved through them with methodical attention to ordinary things. Correspondence, her mother's requests, the work of the winter garden, the small necessary business of simply being at Colville Park. She ate well enough, She slept adequately, which was not the same as sleeping well, but was considerably better than nothing. She held several conversations about topics of no particular consequence, and contributed to them with every appearance of her normal self. She did not hear from him. She told herself this was expected. She told herself it was the correct outcome, and that she had chosen it by placing the ring in his palm, and she did not regret it. She almost entirely did not regret it. On the 5th day, a letter arrived addressed directly to her in handwriting she recognized before she had properly read the direction. Miss Colville, it began. She noted the formality of it and felt it land. I have written 5 versions of this letter and destroyed all of them on the grounds that the correct version would be a lie, and I think we are past the point where another lie between us serves any useful purpose. Here is what is true. What I said at the Silver Heart, in that room with everyone listening, was not what I meant by it. You know what I meant. I am entirely certain you know. But knowing what I meant and knowing what it sounded like are not the same thing, and I cannot ask you to accept the first without addressing the second. I heard myself say it. I saw your face. I know what it cost. I am not writing to ask your forgiveness, because that is not mine to ask for. I am writing to ask if you would permit me to come, not as the man from the Silver Heart, not as the arrangement that was never arranged, simply as myself, Aldrich Vane, who has been managing the distance between himself and Marin Colville for 3 years with increasingly poor results, and who would like very much to stop. I have a great deal more to say. I would rather say it looking at you than writing it. A V. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about 3 years and 5 days, and the cold side of the bed, and the ring placed in his palm, and the look on his face in the lane when she had said, "You said it 3 years ago in Dorian's hallway." She thought. She was either very brave or very foolish. She had always found those two things more difficult to distinguish than anyone made them sound. She wrote 3 words on a sheet of paper, folded it, and sent it before she could construct reasons not to. Come then, I will be here. MC. He came on the 6th morning. She was in the winter garden, doing what she had been doing for 6 mornings, which was tending to things that required attention and had nothing to do with Aldrich Vane. She had never paid such close attention to the winter garden. It had never been better for it. She heard a carriage on the drive. She put down her shears. Then she heard a second voice, not Aldrich's, from the direction of the front gate, and understood before she had finished turning that Prentice Hale had arrived at Colville Park on the same morning, which was the kind of timing that suggested the universe had opinions. She went around the corner of the house and found them on the front steps. Prentice was smiling. Aldrich had the stillness of controlled anger. The butler stood between them with the expression of a man caught between 2 inconvenient facts. "Mr. Hale," she said. Both men turned. "Miss Colville." Prentice was warm and sociable and entirely too comfortable. "I found myself in the neighborhood. We have mutual friends in the Fenwick family." "You are intruding," Aldrich said. Prentice looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has decided not to take offense at things not worth taking offense at. "I am calling on Miss Colville, Vane. I believe that is within my rights as an acquaintance of her family." "It is not a right you have," Aldrich said, with a precision that was not anger, but was something adjacent to it, something more sustained and more deliberate than anger. "You made certain of that at the Silver Heart. Everything you said and did there, the offers, the threats dressed as concern, the speech about first thoughts and calculations and architecture, all of it was in service of this, of standing at this woman's door and presenting yourself as the alternative. And I am telling you clearly that it will not work. I was not aware you had the authority here. I heard you," Aldrich said, "at the inn, the 2nd day. You were speaking to two men by the fire, and you said that Maren Colville had always been partial to you, and that she had come into considerable family money, and that the man she was traveling with was a nobody who could be handled. He held Prentice's gaze without blinking. I said nothing then, because I hoped I had misheard. I did not mishear. Prentice was very still. Your family's financial situation is known, Aldrich continued, with the same even quiet, as is the fact that you have been looking for a particular solution to it for the better part of 2 years. I have no interest in making that information public, but I want it understood, by you, and clearly, that Maren Colville is not available as a solution to anything. A pause. Call on whomever you like in the Fenwick family. Good morning. Prentice looked at Maren for a long moment. His expression had changed, the sociability stripped away, something underneath it that was harder and less charitable. Then, because there was nothing useful left for him in this, he inclined his head slightly and walked back to his carriage and left. The lane was quiet. Aldrich looked at her. You heard him, she said. At the inn. You knew what he was doing. From the second day. Why did you not tell me? He was quiet for a moment. Because I hoped I was wrong about him, and because telling you would have required me to explain how I knew, which would have required me to explain that I was listening for exactly that kind of thing, which would have required me to admit why. He looked at the lane where Prentice's carriage had been. I was not ready to admit why. She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 7 days across various distances, and this was the first time she was looking at him without anything between them. No room, no other people, no performance being maintained. Come into the garden, she said. They walked to the far wall of the garden, where the view opened onto the fields below, silver and still in the winter morning. Say what you came to say, she said. All of it. He stood beside her, and she could feel him assembling it. Not the managed version, but the true one. I have been in love with you, he said, for 3 years. She stood very still. It started at the Allerwick dinner, 3 winters ago. You were talking with someone across the table, and you said something that made the person beside you laugh, and the thought arrived fully formed and completely clear. I have been looking in the wrong direction this entire time. He stopped. He looked at the frost on the ground. I spent 3 years telling myself it was inappropriate, that you were Dorian's sister, that love in my world is a luxury that has to justify itself against everything else it costs, and that the cost in this case was too high. And then the storm, she said, and then the storm. And 3 days in which I discovered that proximity to someone you love and have spent 3 years not loving is significantly more taxing than anyone prepares you for. He looked at her then, directly. And one night in which I did something I have no right to regret and find, in spite of everything, that I do not regret it. She looked at him. What did you say at the inn? I know what I said. Say it again. Say what you meant. He was quiet for a moment. I meant that the situation had not been arranged, that none of it was planned, that you, were not part of what I had come to the Silver Heart expecting to manage. His jaw tightened. I meant it as a statement of fact about the arrangement, not about you. I know, she said, and it sounded like everything you had ever thought about me. It was not. I know that too. Now. She looked at the frost on the wall between them. I heard you that night in Dorian's hallway, 3 years ago. You said I wasn't what one would order for a quiet evening. I know. You knew. Dorian told me, a year afterward. He said you had been in the hallway, and he did not know for how long. He looked at her. I've been trying to find a way to account for it ever since, and have not managed a version that is adequate. It was not kind, she said. No, it was not. It made me believe that what I felt was foolish, that you saw me as noise in a room where you wanted quiet. His expression was entirely unguarded, in a way she now understood was rare and specific, and cost him something real. You are the most interesting sound in any room you have ever been in, he said. That was precisely the problem. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You ended the understanding with Lady Sylvain before we even left Marchfield. Yes. Before the storm, before the inn, before any of it. Yes. Why? He met her eyes. Because I could not in conscience pursue an alliance with one woman while being unable to stop thinking about another. A pause. I had been trying to stop for 3 years. I had not been succeeding. The morning we left Marchfield, I understood that I was not going to succeed, and that continuing to try was a specific kind of dishonesty I was no longer willing to practice. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, What do you want, Aldrich? Not what is appropriate? Not what is manageable? What do you actually want? You, he said. No architecture, no management, just the word, plain and whole. I want to court you properly, in daylight, in front of everyone, with Dorian's knowledge, and your family's blessing, and no false names, and no shared rooms in country inns. I want to stand next to you at every event for the rest of the season and the one after it. I want to be the person you say things to that make the people beside you laugh. He looked at his hand. The ring was in his pocket. She had thought about that, how he must have been carrying it since the morning she gave it back. I want to give this back to you, properly, as a question rather than a fiction. She looked at the ring in his palm. She looked at him. She took the ring. She held it for a moment in her own hand, the weight of it, the warmth it had kept from his pocket. Then she placed it in his hand again. Ask the question, she said. He looked at her. He understood. He took her hand. He looked at it, and at the ring, and at her face. And then he said, May I? She held out her left hand. He put the ring on her finger, where it had been, where it fit, where it sat as though it had always meant to be there. Yes, she said. That is the answer to the question. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the ring on her hand. Then he looked at her face with the expression of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just set it down. She thought, that is the most honest thing he has ever looked. They told Dorian that afternoon. He was in his study. They went in together, and she stood beside Aldrich in a way that made the situation clear before either of them had said a word. Dorian looked at them. He looked at the ring on her finger. He sat back in his chair. He did not speak for a long time. You, he said to Aldrich, slowly and with precision, have been in love with my sister. For 3 years, Aldrich said. Yes. And you are only telling me this now. I was telling myself it was something else. I was not very convincing. Dorian looked at Marin. And you? I have been telling myself something similar, she said. Apparently, it runs in certain company. Dorian looked at the ceiling. He appeared to be conducting some internal negotiation. Then he looked back at them with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he was not expecting. You spent 3 days alone with her in a country inn, he said to Aldrich. Flat. Factual. Yes. Under false names. Yes. And invented an engagement. For the purposes of managing the situation. Yes. And the ring. My mother's. I gave it to her to support the fiction. A pause. I would like to give it to her now, for other reasons. Dorian looked at the ring on Marin's finger for a moment, then at Aldrich. You understand that if you hurt her, I will consider our friendship concluded. I understand that. I mean it with complete sincerity. I know you do. It is one of the things I have always valued about you. Aldrich held his gaze. I have no intention of hurting her. I have every intention of spending a significant amount of effort doing the opposite. Dorian was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at his sister. Is this what you want? He said. Yes, she said. Considerably. Even knowing what it will cost. The gossip when it comes out about the inn. The whispers about your reputation. His family's objections. His family's objections are his to manage, she said. The rest I can weather. She doesn't have to weather it alone, Aldrich said. Dorian looked between them. Something shifted in his face. You are both extremely stubborn people, he said. God help whatever household you attempt to run together. He stood and extended his hand to Aldrich. Formally ask her, properly, with my father present. Aldrich shook his hand. Thank you. She will keep you accountable to it. That is not a warning. It is a statement of fact. He looked at Marin. If at any point this becomes something you do not want. I will tell you, she said. He put his arms around her briefly, the same assessment he had performed on the front steps, and pressed his mouth to the top of her head. Deeply inconvenient, he said, with the specific affection she had known her entire life. Both of you. They left him there. The scandal reached London in approximately 11 days, faster than hoped. The story acquired details in transit. 1 room, 1 corridor, 1 narrow bed, and by the 3rd dinner party, Marin had apparently arrived at the Silver Heart in her nightgown, which was inventive. She weathered it with her mother and Dorian on either side, and Aldrich, who called every day, sat through 2 uncomfortable drawing-room visits, and stood beside her at the Fenwick Assembly, when 3 women chose not to greet her. He made it publicly clear that the matter of Marin Colville's character was settled by his own estimation of it. His father summoned him to London and said several things at volume. Aldrich listened. He told his father he understood the concerns and was going to court Marin Colville regardless. The Duke said more things. Aldrich went back to Colville Park. His mother, who was not the Duke, sent Marin a short letter saying she was very glad Aldrich had found someone who could apparently tolerate him, and that the ring had been her own grandmother's first, and she was glad to know where it had ended up. 3 months after the morning in the Winter Garden, Aldrich asked the question properly. In the Colville Park drawing room, with her father and mother present, and Dorian standing in the doorway failing to look as though he had not positioned himself there specifically to witness it. He got on one knee, which he did not do naturally, being the kind of man who generally does everything standing, and asked for her hand. She said yes before he had finished asking. The wedding was small and in the spring, the bare winter hedgerows replaced by something considerably more optimistic. The Duke of Westhollow was present, not enthusiastically, but present, which Aldrich's mother said was more than she had expected, and Dorian said was more than the man deserved. Aldrich said, with the particular dryness she had learned was his version of affection, that he was grateful his father had managed to locate the occasion on the calendar. Marin wore her own ring. Epilogue. 2 years later, on a winter evening that smelled of wood smoke and pine, Marin stood in the entrance hall of Westhollow Park and looked out at the snow coming down in the last of the light. Christmas in 3 days. The house full of people she loved, their voices carrying from the drawing room, where Dorian was telling a story that had her mother laughing and her father protesting, and Aldrich's mother joining in on whichever side was winning. You are doing the thing again, Aldrich said from behind her. She turned. He was in his shirt sleeves, which still slightly surprised her, the deliberate ease of a man who had stopped performing things he did not need to perform. He leaned in the doorway of the hall with a glass in his hand and looked at her with the expression she had no longer needed to look at sideways to read. "What thing?" she said. "The standing in hallways, looking at weather thing." He came to stand beside her. Outside, the snow was falling steadily over the park, covering the winter garden, settling on the drive. "You did it at the Silver Heart, too, standing at the window, looking at the rain." "I was thinking about something." "Then? Or now?" "Both." She looked at the ring on her finger. 2 years of wear had done nothing to it. It sat exactly as it had sat when he had placed it there for the first time, in a freezing room at a country inn with a dead fire and rain at the glass. "I was thinking about what you said at the inn that morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Which thing?" I said. She was not what I had in mind for this arrangement. She looked at him. "You were not wrong, technically." "I was absolutely wrong." "You meant the situation was not planned." "I meant," he said, "that you had spent 5 years being precisely what I had always wanted, and I had spent 5 years telling myself that was a problem I could manage." He took her hand. He looked at the ring on it. "I was wrong about that, too. I could not manage it at all, as it turns out." She looked at him. The snow came down outside. From the drawing room, Dorian's voice rose above the laughter. "You ordered a quiet evening," she said, "and you got something else entirely." "I got something I would not trade for anything in the world." He brought her hand to his mouth, the way he had at the supper table 3 days into a storm, when the gesture had been performance and had not felt like performance at all, including the quiet. She moved into his arms, because she could, because this was her house, and her life and her choice, every part of it chosen with full information and no false names. "She is not what one would order for a quiet evening," she said into his shoulder. "No," he agreed, his arms tightening around her. "She is not what I ordered. She is what I would have asked for if I had known what I was missing, if I had been brave enough, if I had been honest enough to ask." She looked at the ring. She looked at the snow. She thought about the hallway 3 years ago, and the inn, and the ring placed in his palm, and the cold, empty side of the bed, and the letter, and the winter garden, and the question asked properly, and all the particular choices that had brought them from that hallway to this one. Some things have to travel a long way to arrive at where they were always going. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, someone in the drawing room said something that made everyone laugh at once. The sound of it carrying through the house, warm and real and absolutely ordinary. And in the entrance hall of West Hallow Park, on a winter evening 2 years into a life she had chosen with her eyes open, Marin Colville, who was now Marin Vane, stood in her husband's arms and thought, "This is exactly what I would have ordered. This, precisely this, if I had known to ask."